Hello from my side. Welcome, and thank you, Cornelia and Felix, for inviting me. I would say we will directly jump into the book, which you have already seen here. And I want to start from the beginning and ask the both of you, you're doing field work, both of you, in your different projects. And one of it is called breathing data and one of it is called animal data. So could you tell us briefly, what is it about?
Yeah, maybe let me start. The research took place in the context of a larger research program called Latent Spaces Performing Ambiguous Data. And the starting point was an interest in the tension between the numeric precision of data and, you could probably say, the semantic ambiguity of data. So very often we know how to measure, but we don't really know what it means or what it is that we are measuring. And we thought this ambiguity was actually an interesting thing. It was an opening for discussion and for political engagement, rather than waiting for the number to come out at the end of the process and then tell us what to do. We were all thinking about this during the COVID pandemic, when we all were looking at these, flatten the curves and this, presentation of data as truth. And while we're not necessarily saying that, this wasn't a kind of COVID critical thing or so, but these things are ambiguous. They are not so clear. And that's a good thing, we find. And as artists, or in our context, is very well suited to deal with these ambiguities as an opening rather than as a closing or a confusion. And one of the projects, animal data, we became interested in the data that's produced by wild animals and the kind of nature that this produces and the kind of relation between animal bodies, technologies, humans, society, and smaller and larger ecosystems, that this was framing and reframing in a way that was quite surprising to us or unclear. And we started to look into that and came across a rewilding project of a migratory bird. You can see this here. The bird is called northern bald ibis in English and Waldrapp in German. And we thought this was quite a straightforward, bird tracker. You open the cage and the bird flies out, and that's what rewilding means, but it turns out it doesn't. It's much more complex, and as a first approximation to this complexity, we started to map all the different elements and dimensions that create this anthropogenic environment and this infrastructure on which the bird can become wild in a way that we'll talk about what that means. And so we've been exploring this tension between the bird with its needs, the technology with its needs, the institutional frameworks with their needs and dimensions, climate change moving in, and from that then led to the the collaboration or conversation with Cornelia's project.
Right, because when you say we did the bird project, it's not the two of us?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Can you explain?
Yes, okay. So the initial research was done together with Gordan Savicic, and then you perhaps recognize this, invited Vladan Joler to help us with thinking through this mass of data through the medium of a visual representation.
Exactly. So now comes my project, which started also within the framework of latent spaces, but with a different sort of data. also embodied data, but it was actually data related to my body. And just a few points about breathing data. First of all, it's a self-experiment, so I'm not just the researcher of the project, but I'm also the object of research. So it's about my body and the data of my body. It's a self-quantification project, which also raised the question, self-quantification you can critically frame. Is it just about exploiting of data, or how important is the aspect of self-care, or how can we balance this? So the subject of the study is the body, and my mind of the researcher, because I was taking data with different systems, sensors for collecting data. So I had a number of data, but I wanted to juxtapose the data with my own experiences during the time. So there was a set time limit of 3 months in which I used different trackers, and at the same time, because at the center of the research project, as the title says, breathing data, was that I started with the assumption when I do daily breathing exercises, my body data will change. Preferably, of course, will get better in the sense I'll be more relaxed, my heart rate becomes lower, and so on and so forth. It's expressed in different parameter you can measure. And so for the collection, different sensors, we probably see it later also when we go deeper into the project, but for once I have this ring that collects data. It's a so-called smart ring that collects data 24/7 all the time. It just needs to be recharged every now and then. And during the breathing exercises I had an extra belt that a lot of people who do sports and measure trainings, it's a tracker that is closer to the heart, and so it provides more precise heart rate. So that was basically the idea, and also this was part of the method because I didn't know about breathing exercises before. I was collaborating with a brain researcher who at the same time was or is a yoga teacher. So in the beginning he taught me, or he suggested, or we developed together a program for my 30 minutes exercises. But then he also gave me advice on what data to use, what parameter, and what means what, because as Felix said, you can collect a lot of data. As I found later, I collected altogether almost 30 million data points in 3 months. And you look at the data and you have no idea what these data say. So you need experts also to interpret the data, but at the same time I always wanted to juxtapose the data with my personal experience during the time. And that's why it was part of the methodology that I kept a minutes diary where I was noting about stressors, what's happening in the day, how do I feel, etc. So you could, if there is something remarkable, in the curve, you could see how does this relate to some stress or something. So it's both. It's the objective measuring, objective, and at the same time, so I look at the data that are provided through the technology, but at the same time I basically look from inside out and say, how does this come together? That's breathing data.
So you have already mentioned that both of you have been working with collaborators, with other scientists, with artists, activists, and so on. When did you decide, or how come that the both projects that were developed independently came into touch and into dialogue?
I don't know, would you say something? Or you can start, Felix, and then I join you.
Yeah, so we
There's the contemporary image.
You will tell me what to say? Yeah, okay, you can say it, but I'll tell you what it is. Okay, so we were invited by the editors of this series, the contemporary condition, first for a talk and then for the book. And what they where they start with what they see as the contemporary condition is that they are interested in the coming together of different time frames, different types of temporalities. So the idea is less that something comes together in time, but the coming together of times. So, and this was also then our starting point to think about the different temporalities that structure each of our fields that we were working in. And maybe go to the next slide. When we were doing the mapping of the bird project and these infrastructures, we were interested in the heterogeneity of what comes together. So we were putting together a kind of a relational graph that looked at the different elements, how they relate. And then we also thought about the different scales that come together. And we developed 3 scales, kind of a spatial scale that juxtaposes elements that are several thousand kilometers, which is kind of the migratory range of the bird, with things in the millimeter range, with the tracker and the bugs that the bird feeds on, just to see how these different scales come together. And the same, we did one for monetary scale, because everything has a price, even the bird. But also we got interested in a temporal scale. So what kind of rhythms are, need to come together for a project like this to work. And so we initially decided to divide it into 3 elements. So we had a geological scale that goes all the way back 1 million years, which is the genetic age of the bird. It hasn't really evolved in the last 1 million years. One can see that from archaeological studies. Then we were interested in a biological time, so time that corresponds to a lived experience over the last 70, 80 years, down to the 1 second layer that we can also still perceive with our normal senses, and then down to what we initially called the atomic time, kind of the sub-second time, down to 1 millionth of a second, which is the amplitude of the GPS signal. So we had a range in terms of times from 1 million years to a millionth of a second. And somehow these were co-present in that network, and they need to come into sync in some way for the whole thing to work. So the tracker needs to be capable of picking up this amplitude, but it also needs to fit a bird's body that is 1 million years old. And we were quite interested in this in this heterogeneity, not just of objects, technical, natural, social object, but also timescales. And that kind of opened up, that resonated with their understanding of what the contemporary is, a coming together of times.
Yeah. So I slowly go back again to their definition of contemporaneity, because it is a little bit complex, and I have to say also it's important to emphasize that also we were working within the framework of the same research project. We did not work together, or we did not kind of compare our projects until, except a little bit like jokingly, I'm saying, yeah, I am what the bird is in your bird. But it was until we got this invitation to contribute to the book, and this notion of coming together in time of different temporalities, that we started to engage in a dialogue, because they explicitly had invited Felix and me to write something about our projects, and then we decided it would be nice to have a dialogue, an exchange dialogue. And what Felix explained before about the different temporal scales that you had already developed for the bird mapping that existed already. So that were the inspiration basically to use it for our dialogue as a underlying structure or thinking structure, and then we expanded it. We expanded basically from 3 scales to 4 scales, and the 4 scales are, or the 4 temporalities are what we called in the end lived time, historical time, evolutionary time, and data time. So that's also, if you look the contents of the book, that's how we structured our dialogue, because with each of the temporalities come a number of complexities in itself and different aspects, and so we started to compare our 2 research projects related to these different temporalities.
I found a very fascinating 2 or 3 sentences right at the beginning that I want to read to you, referring to the 4 concepts of time that we have just heard about. So it says in the chapter called Departure, the way these times relate to each other contributes significantly to the character and potentiality of any specific situation. This approach can quickly lead to fractal vertigo, because many of these actors are themselves also composites, bringing together different temporalities and so on, all the way down. And so vertigo stayed with me because it appears again some pages later, where you talked about staving off vertigo. So could you elaborate a little bit on the vertigo or the vertigo effect? I think it's called. But what causes vertigo and what maybe dissolves it?
Yeah. I mean, the vertigo is caused when you don't work on a fixed ontological plane, but you see these things, as we wrote, as composites. And once you start taking things apart and say they're actually composites of different elements that each have their own particular logic and come together in a particular way, then it's really the question, okay, look a bit closer, and each of the elements that form a composite are themselves composites. And we already encountered this with the mapping. Every mapping project has the question of where do you stop. And for example, we decided that we will not open the tracker. We're not interested in the age of the minerals and the global production chain that produces this, but we really take the kind of the animal body as the center and look at what touches, so to speak, that body, and then don't go any further. So it's a way of kind of limiting a potentially endless exercise of deconstruction. And this is also why the way we structured the dialogue was really going, kind of starting and centering around these 2 kind of field studies that have their own dimensions, their own temporal frameworks, and not try to cover everything, because obviously that's impossible. So the grounding is the situatedness. We said it's situated in 2 very precise historical moments in a number of bodies that you can name and point to: her body, the birds, the biologists, us ourselves working there, and that allows us to, on the one hand, unfold a certain complexity, but also bind it back to something that limits the complexity. Otherwise, it's really hard to say where to stop.
Yeah, for me it was fascinating that the 4 times, the concept of the 4 times, that they work like a scaffolding or like a railing, but so that I can navigate also through my own work or things that I associate with the field work you do, but it also leaves a lot of space or to space to combine the four concepts of time, or maybe also add voices that you introduce. And yeah, let's maybe go to the first chapter, Lived Time. Cornelia, would you like to explain from your project, Breathing Data, what is lived time, how it is represented or depicted?
Yeah, that's how we define lived time, is the time a single member of a species can experience. So in my case, it's a species, human species, so it's the time when I'm born until I die. And in the bird's case, it's a bit shorter. And so it's a very, we start with the embodiedness of this category, but also we discuss a little bit about what is actually life in this first chapter, because it's related to something alive and living, which is not the case in the other categories. Maybe you want to explain the lived time?
Yeah, I mean, for us it was really important to also, coming from this, from the data, from an interest in data, not to see this as something that abstracts from the embodiment, but actually leads into a different understanding of the embodiment. And embodiment is really crucial in these projects. In terms of the bird project, the embodiment is really a living together of birds and humans in a way that there is what is called an imprinting. So as a strong relationship is formed, which is necessary for the humans to be able to show the birds how to migrate, because this is something they learn. It's not genetically. There's a genetic disposition, but the knowledge about the routes and the destinations of migration are socially learned. And since that bird that is being rewilded died out 400 years ago in this area, in kind of Central Europe, there was no knowledge about where to migrate. So they had to be taught where to migrate. And for that, there has to be a very close relationship, an embodied relationship, and a trust relationship between people and the animals in order to allow them to follow people to their destination. And then there has to be a debonding because they're supposed to be wild animals, so they shouldn't be bonded to people too closely. So there's a constant modulation of this embodied experience now between the biologists and the birds.
And if I may add this, in my project, in the lived time, basically, through the breathing exercises, I create an impact on my body, on the lived time. That also makes a difference in the quality and the duration, etc. So it's a manipulation of my lived time, basically, through techniques.
I would suggest we directly go to the next chapter, because it has to do with the chapter that we're just talking about. And you just mentioned the imprint and so lived time. Talking about the bird is co-lived time, is cohabitation, and let's talk about cohabitation and historical time. And we thought we would read something, or you would read something to you from the book, right?
Yeah. So first, I just explain this definition, or how we define historical time briefly. It refers to cultural history and the diverse set of cultural resources that human and non-human actors can possibly mobilize. It is the time span of the last 10,000 years during which human cultures left traces. So just to give you an orientation what the different scales are. So the first was the body, human and animal body, and now we're talking about cultural history, which we can trace back about 10,000 years.
Okay, so let me read a little bit. The bird itself has a documented social history of about 5,000 years. It is in part due to the fact that this particular species is heteromophile, which means it follows culture. That is, it thrives in cultivated area, particularly freshly cut fields and meadows, where they have easy access to bugs and worms, staple of the bird's diet. Thus, one can assume that the cohabitation of humans and the northern bald ibises started with the beginning of agriculture. Working the land made humans interesting to the birds. The first actual documentation is from ancient Egypt, where the bird was called Ark, which is usually translated as blessed ancestor spirit, indicating that the spiritual reading of the bird's presence. We know that the birds lived at the time in rock walls at the eastern shore of the Nile, so it might have been connected to the rising sun.
Okay, and the breathing practice that is central to my study is part of the yoga tradition, whose historical horizon is about 3,000 to 4,000 years. The exact numbers are contested and depend on the way one understands the development, or rather how much of today's diverse constellations of yoga practices can be considered as a direct successor of the first known forms. Commonly, the origins of yoga are tracked back to the Indus Valley civilization, which existed around 3,300 before Christ, in what is now Pakistan or northwest India.
So now how would you connect this history with the contemporary?
The history of yoga is present both as an accumulation... Oh no, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Looking into the history of yoga, I learned that many key Indian texts, such as the Yoga Sutra, only come into being through Western influences, and the worldwide spread or further development of yoga as we experience it today would be inconceivable without a mutual exchange between East and West. Does this imply an alienation that began with colonialism and continues to this day? Do we have to go back to pre-colonial times to understand what authentic yoga is? And then, when would that period of authenticity be? And who is legitimized to account for it? The various approaches to decolonizing yoga deal with precisely these questions. I find the voices that warn against simply going back to pre-colonial times in order to find a pure original state particularly interesting. Instead of essentializing and glorifying the pre-colonial area, they suggest thinking of yoga in the context of a broadly conceived anti-authoritarian and holistic liberation practice, which means to also consider the forms of hierarchization and violence that existed before colonialism and the role yoga played in this.
You mentioned how history is evoked in different ways to justify or critique different contemporary practices. There is a famous woodcut of the bird in Konrad's Gessner Historia Animalum from 1555, we've seen it before, which indicates that this bird was a local species in the area of Central Europe, hunted for its tender meat. At this point, in the mid-16th century, when it appeared in the natural history, it was already what we could call today an endangered species, because soon after that publication, provisions against hunting were issued, but to no avail. The bird was last seen in Europe in 1621. But this reading is not without detractors. Is the northern bald ibis really a native species? This question hinges on two considerations. One, whether the historical record is sufficiently clear that the bird actually lived over a long time and in sufficient numbers in this area to be regarded as native. If not, then the current project would not be a restoration, but the induction of an invasive species. In the background of this discussion, there are deep conflicting commitments to how to understand nature as a homeostatic or a dynamic system, and whether homeostasis is even still possible under the conditions of the Anthropocene.
Thank you.
Ich kann noch diesen kleinen Abschnitt lesen. Ja.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
And the question of historical time always includes the question of the period and geographical area for which a kind of original state is assumed. What constitutes a native species is comparable to the question of a native cultural technique, and thus the question of who is morally entitled to practice certain cultural techniques. The vehement discussions about cultural appropriation are a clear indication of this and also take place particularly in connection with yoga. So the question of authenticity, where you start to, situate, locate it.
Yeah, for me it becomes clear that for both of your projects there is no back to nature, back to an essence, back to a native origin that you want to establish somehow. And I want to go back to this. I don't know if all of you are familiar with what a hemerophile is. In German it's called the Kulturfolger. I had to look it up, I had no clue. Hemerophile.
What's the German word?
Kulturfolger. So it basically means, you know what Kulturfolger is?
No.
Okay, me too. So Kulturfolger, I mean, we have heard it very briefly, but I wanted to mention it again. It thrives in cultivated areas. So the Waldrapp, the ibis, thrives in already man-made, so to say, human-made, anthropogenic landscapes. Nevertheless, the bird is older than humans are, right?
It's older, but it's just easier for the birds to live in human environments, like rats, right?
And
they like human environments because it's easy for them.
And this is for me this sort of a vertigo thing that is happening. That you always connect your projects with ancient times, ancient wisdom, so to say. But the way you do it is not reactionary, not at all. And it is for me very interesting to know more about what the concept of the wild actually is, because it's mentioned several times, the wild and the rewilding. How would you describe that briefly? What is the? You already mentioned a little bit. What is wild at the IBIS today?
The biologists who work on this project, they really dislike the term rewilding, precisely because of that question. But it's an often used term, and I kind of like it, so I don't mind. Kind of traditionally, in Western thinking, we had this very strong separation kind of nature and culture, and wild was nature that was not touched by human culture. And there are still deep commitments in ecological thinking about this. Right? There's, for example, this idea of the half-Earth project, where you would have to set half of the land mass kind of, set outside of human interference, so that could develop in its own. It's kind of a self-willed nature idea. But I think this idea is, for a lot of reasons, very problematic, and I don't think we need to go into all of them. So what this project and this rewilding initiatives more generally do is not to return to some pre-cultural idea, which in times of climate change would be difficult anyway. But to really think about setting up environments and relationships and infrastructures that increase the relative autonomy of the actors within it. So there is a difference between a bird flying on its own and a bird living in an aviary, even though the bird flying on its own in this particular case, carries a tracker, which is a technological device that is necessary to build up the supporting infrastructure for this small population to survive and to grow to the point where it can become self-sustainable. But even self-sustainable does not mean, in this case, that no human interference will ever be necessary. It simply means that it can reproduce itself. But the understanding that there's a long-term relationship necessary, that is a constant care necessary for this bird to live in this anthropogenic environment that is heavily damaged and hugely cultured and has a lot of kind of dangerous elements in it. This will continue. So the wilderness is a kind of a relation that allows for autonomy rather than the absence of a relation.
Donna Haraway had this idea about sims or symbionts. Is that also true for the ibis and the humans? Or sympoiesis? There are some sim words in Haraway.
Yeah.
Symbiosis.
I think that the biologists would prefer not to see it that way, simply because you cannot write a funding proposition for a project that will go on forever. You have to reach self-sustainability. So they defined it in a way that works, kind of, but isn't absence of care. So if you take this symbiosis as a general condition of heterogeneous organisms kind of requiring each other for their mutual survival, I think you could say so.
Okay, if you don't want to add
I have
more.
nothing to say about wilderness.
No?
I'm not interested. Maybe in wild thinking, but not so.
Okay. Then I would suggest we go to the next chapter called Evolutionary Time. And this chapter is already in the midst of coping with climate crisis, coping with mass extinction. And it is, one could think that it takes a step back compared to historical times, so talking about natural history, but it becomes quite clear very fast that that there's also a technosphere that is not external anymore when we think about evolutionary time, but a technosphere that is always already, how can I put it, entangled. And I think we have chosen
Maybe
something.
I can quickly also read the
Something.
definition.
Yes. And then we wanted to read again
yeah.
to hear about evolutionary
So
time.
how we define evolutionary time, it's kind of what we usually understand as natural history. And in our context, it basically means a collision between natural evolution and the impact of technological processes. You already pointed to that. So we cannot think anymore just of natural development without taking into consideration technical developments. So who starts to read? We need direction, please. What shall we do?
And you're first.
I'm first, page 49.
49.
Okay.
Looking at,
Looking at evolutionary processes in the context of breathing, suggests expanding the notion of evolution to co-evolution. Therefore, I open up a larger time frame which goes far beyond our own species. It makes no sense to think of the human body and the way it functions independently of the world we inhabit. This means nothing other than that our bodies must also change as an adaptation to a changing environment. And interestingly, for the first time in history, the history of evolution, it is the human species itself that changes its living conditions on this fundamental level.
Technology certainly plays an important role. The Earth's system science has started to speak of the technosphere as the fifth major metabolic cycle next to the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. In this view, humans are part of the technosphere and have always been since the beginning of agriculture, since their survival depends on the existence of this sphere, and it's the technosphere that mediates the relationship between humans and nature. That the number of humans has been able to increase from about 10 million at the advent of agriculture to 8 billion living today indicates the existential character of this sphere for human culture. Like all spheres, the technosphere interacts with the other spheres, most directly with the biosphere through the transformation of landscapes, selective breeding of certain plants and species, and the extermination of others. What is new today is that the interaction becomes destabilizing to the biosphere as a whole and is also impacting on the other sphere, particularly the atmosphere. In a way, one could say the contemporary moment is characterized by the technosphere expanding to the point where it begins to merge with the biosphere and the atmosphere. By merging, I mean that ever more aspects of the biosphere are becoming dependent on the technosphere, like the bird with the tracker, and the socio-technical aspects of human culture for their own survival. Up to now, the technosphere was external to the other spheres. They were, of course, impacted by human culture, but not dependent on it, not anymore. Perhaps this is the reason the concept of the planetary has become so central recently. The great challenge is then how to articulate these dependencies that is not just extractivist, exploitative, and destructive.
Mm-hmm. What you have described so far is a technosphere that has had contradictory effects. It has allowed the human species to thrive on this planet, but in doing so has caused so much damage to the biosphere that the continued existence of humanity as a whole is at risk, or at least the living conditions are changing in a way that will make it more difficult for humans to survive. So the main question is whether we can use or change the technosphere in such a way that it no longer has a destructive effect on the biosphere and, on the contrary, can perhaps even have a healing effect.
Yes, this is also my question. How? I want to repeat it. How can we use the technosphere in a way that it can perhaps even have a healing effect?
Maybe I can start to elaborate a little bit, with using these rings, because it's of course a central question of the whole project. What is the role of technology? Because I could also do breathing exercises without using a ring. But the question is, would I? And what would be different? And just exploring myself and being honest, I realized that this time frame where I was part of this research project and the measurements and everything, and I had to collect measurements and compare with the data scientists and discuss. It was almost not possible not to measure for a day, because when he would say, where are your data from yesterday? Why didn't you do your exercises and so on? So in a way it forced me a little bit to do these exercises, which of course I could have done, but in the end we agreed on, at least in my case, to look at these technologies as a bridge, because what they also do, these technologies, they raise an awareness about body conditions, about certain, I could, with enough training probably also do it without, but the measuring like when I look every morning at the data of the day before, and then of course I always compare it, and that's also funny because sometimes I think I really slept really badly, and they said, "Congratulations, you had a great night." And I think, "Did I? Okay, then I feel much better." And the other way around. So there's always this constant dialogue also with the data, and the question is, as you said, how, is it a coexistence forever? And I don't think so. I don't like the idea of being dependent on this technology for the rest of my life, but I still am, and I'm observing how in the long term, because for the 3 months I used the 2 different measure technologies is one thing, but I still use the ring now for 2 years. And it changed a lot. It changes my awareness and my body awareness. So I like to think that it's also a bridge to raise my body awareness, and at one point I will just throw it away and say, I don't need you anymore. So I have developed the senses, or a sensitivity towards my own body, which I didn't have before. So that's the idea. And what was the question?
I was just going to say there's also a chart in the book showing the sort of healing curve, right? While one cycle of exercises. So
Which graph is this?
Because what I found interesting is that that you're talking about a 3-month long experiment, or even a bit longer, where you're basically doing every day the exercises, and then you have different curves, like throughout the 3 months, but also during a day, right? And this describes the improvement already during a day.
Yeah. So, and it's of course also encouraging if you see. So what I mainly learned, maybe that's interesting to share, wearing the ring, is that I sleep much less than I thought. I always thought of myself, oh my God, you sleep too long, you have to get up earlier, and no, I don't. I actually should sleep much, maybe not longer in the morning, but I should go to bed earlier. That's what I learned, and I try to do it. You have to, you adapt habits, you learn to readjust things, but for an improvement of your own health, etc. So it has an impact, and it's a kind of interesting coexistence between the technology and my own whatever subconscious and things that are operating, my behavior.
And is there also something like an idea of cohabitation, like in the project of the IBIS that you noticed during the exercises or during the 3 months?
Yeah, it's a
like where does the air come from and so on?
Yeah, it's a completely different experience than in the bird project. I think it's probably because of this continuity of the breathing exercises, because you have to sit down and do it every day, and that has an impact not only on the data, but it also changes your consciousness very much. And the calmer you get, and the more the kind of ego functions, go in the background, the more you develop this sense of how connected you are. And not only, in an abstract way connected to the universe, but you realize, because during meditation and doing breathing exercises, you focus only on breathing. So you focus on, you have different rhythms, different exercises. So the only thing you do is to take air in, keep it, and take it out again. And this is like the most basic relational activity you can imagine, and it's a very deep, it was a very deep experience for me. Of course, we know that we are breathing air and that we are dependent on this, but to have this very deep sense of being connected with the environment through the air, and that there is basically no autonomous existence of a subject, because we're always independent of what's around us, because life is a permanent exchange between inside and outside. That's actually the definition of life and organism.
I think that you mentioned this notion of technology as a bridge. I think this is quite important, because otherwise you could read what we were talking about as a call to put sensors everywhere. and just add layer and layer and layer of technology. And there are quite a lot of people, thinking like this, and having a technological solution to every problem. And I think in both cases, and this was kind of the first realization when we started to actually go into the field and talk to the biologists, is that the data is a very small, and the technology is a very small aspect. It was a crucial aspect. It's an aspect that allows to re-articulate the relationship. And ideally, you would not need that re-articulation through technology, because it would already be there, a kind of a certain, an understanding of animals as, individual beings with their own histories and to certain variations within them that you could call characteristics or so, that have a value in and of themselves rather than just being a resource to use, right? So you wouldn't necessarily need technology to do that, but technology is a way of establishing a relationship that we don't have necessarily because we live in cities, we don't really are closely connected to a very local environment, and a lot of the processes that we are dealing with are kind of on a scale that we wouldn't perceive anyway without kind of some sort of mediation. And so that's one part, and the other part is in terms of creating this environment, you need a much closer understanding of the bird's behavior in this particular case in order to intervene at the sites of breeding or wintering sites or so, and for that you need relatively fine-grained movement data in this particular case. But ideally, once this is re-established, you don't need all of that data. So I think it's also important to think about certain, how you get rid of this technology at some point, not become fully dependent for everything all the time, everywhere. There are enough cases where we need that, and it's not kind of an anti-technological argument, but it's an argument that technology in this particular case, as in both cases, is not kind of a tool or a means to abstract away. That's also where we started with the live time and the body. It's not a means to abstract away from embodiment, but to understand it perhaps differently. And perhaps this is a particularly steep learning curve for Western culture that traditionally has thought about all of these things in these very fixed and dichotomous categories, and to understand the relationships. And I think technology is a part of that, but it is not kind of to stand in for it. Otherwise, we're ending with these solutionist ideas. Just give everyone a tracker, and we'll know everything. And that clearly is not the case.
Yeah, it just came into my mind that I was just attending a conference with Anat Singh, and she would talk about humans and their kinship relationship with sago trees, so a specific palm tree in West Papua. So she describes like how they are sort of entangled, the tree and the humans, and if the humans have to make important decisions, they sit on the ground, bare ass, she said, they sit on the ground and talk with the roots of the tree, and then they hear what the tree says, and for finding a decision. And then there was some sort of nervosity in the room, and it was in the US, and people said, but we have now the situation here, the rising fascism and so on. What can we learn from these situated practices that are dispersed all over the globe? And there were other impulses also talking about situated knowledges, and I don't want to compare the example, but when you now think about the planetary and you use your both situated projects, how do you come from a very specific situated practice or project? How do you come to the planetary? Is it like the juxtaposition of a multitude of situated practices, or is it scalable, or how would you describe that?
I remember, the kind of when kind of globalization hit kind of everyday experience with cheap flights and internet and whatnot for me at least personally in the 1990s, and there was this idea of these layers. So you had the local and the national, then you had the global, and these were different scales. And what I found interesting in thinking through these very small and particularly located projects was that the planetary is not another scale. It's not just even larger. And now we have the planetary, and then maybe we have the universe. This is not a kind of an onion with layers, right? That become larger and larger. But it's really about the coming together of very heterogeneous processes. And this is what we try to do with these different times. So the certain processes that used to develop over 10,000, 100,000, millions of years are now no longer the stable background for our history, but they're actually kind of an everyday actor. Right? So, climate change is not something that is something that is part of our everyday life, but it evolves over other rhythm than we are used to from other aspects of our everyday life. So for me it's really this coming together of these different rhythms and the different actors and forms of agency that are attached to these different rhythms. And this is not an issue of scale, so you don't have to go from the local to the planetary. In the way you would have to go, think global, act local. It's not like that at all. The planetary is not a scale, it's a condition that allows or makes visible or allows us to think of the heterogeneity of agencies. And that there are human and non-human agencies, living agencies, and perhaps other metabolic processes that are no longer, at least that's how we used to think, of the stable background of human history, right? Why do we have to think about the climate? It has been stable for 10,000 years, which is roughly the age of cultural history, because it isn't anymore, and it becomes a part of something that we have to think about and act about in our everyday life, and we have to make decisions. The Paris Accord was a decision of how the atmosphere was supposed to evolve, and this is a novel situation, and that is scale independent, right? This is on the smaller scale. On the larger scale, it's
the starting point of your question was not about scale, I think, but the kind of the different sort or different quality of knowledge. And I have problems with the question, as you framed it, what can we learn from whatever indigenous people?
I quoted the question.
Yeah, okay, you quoted the question. Because, we have to realize, and that's all over at the moment, the art world gets flooded with indigenous knowledges and, Amazonas and whatever we have to learn from. And I think it's very difficult because there is a long tradition and it's a completely different cultural history and philosophy. It's not just a knowledge that you can take from one location to the other. It's a way of living. And so if you want to share this knowledge, you have to live like this, So I'm very skeptical. At the same time, it's of course interesting. It touches a little bit upon a question also of am I allowed as a Western white woman living in the city to do yoga, which is associated with something else. And for me, the whole discourse of decolonizing yoga and critical yoga studies was really helpful to find an approach that was for me, so I got able to handle it in a way, to know what it is, to know that's also what, and not to kind of think of other knowledges as so much better and unique, and they are clean and original, and we have to go back, or we can learn from them, etc. It can only be an exchange, I think, and it must be. There is no going back anywhere. I mean, we talked about that.
Yeah.
So this knowledge, I think that's interesting. But when I look at artworks of artists going to the Amazonas and doing all this work, I think, yeah, it's interesting. I learn something. I learn that I'm not there, that I'm not thinking like these people do. But then I think the next question is where do we find a quality of, that then points to the planetary? Where can we find our own connection to this coming together? And it has to start in our own situatedness and not in the situatedness of some other place somewhere else, because that's just not where we are. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, we have to do our own homework. We cannot outsource that.
Yeah, and it's just so easy to say, we just do it like they do, and then we have the knowledge. It doesn't work.
I mean, many times there are resources directly under the woods, fossils and copper and all sort of things. So we are related with these people.
Yeah, no, I know. I don't mean with the people, but with the knowledge, with the philosophy, with the perception of how they speak to trees or how they whatever. That's just not where we are.
But before we come to a discussion, hopefully, and we also wanted to do a breathing exercise with you. Maybe you have still time for that.
Yeah, we have a Forst chapter.
Exactly. Before we do that, we still have one missing chapter called Data Time, and I was asking you before. Can I ask you if you were a sort of home? Is it where your home is? Data time. Is it the time where you feel most home of all the four temporalities? And would you like to describe a bit what is data time about compared to the other three temporalities?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I'm home there, but it was kind of the starting point, data. All the three other temporalities have a kind of an ontology to it, right? Lived time is the body, the history. It's something outside of time that structures the rhythm. And data time is really just, as we wrote here, it's just a series of discrete measurements that can articulate any time of any temporal scales, right? You can you can take the movement data of the birds that is kind of in the minute range, and you can articulate it over a long time series that indicate kind of changing movement patterns probably related to climate change. So then it becomes data on a very different scale. Or you can think of astrophysicists can tell you the Big Bang happened 15 billion years ago, and 10 seconds later something else happened, right? Because you can kind of articulate these different times based on these measurements, and in a way the ability to do that is another way of allowing to connect a whole series of processes into a coherent framework, which is also to some degree what the Planetary does. So the ability to even measure these very long time scales, or to measure the very short time scales, or to bring very ephemeral events into a larger time series allows to articulate these different times. But in the measurement, the digital measurement of the data, there is no inherent kind of temporal rhythm inscribed into it other than kind of the atomic oscillation that give you the timestamp.
Cornelia, and for you, what is data time?
It's definitely doesn't resonate as home.
No?
No, it's a strange question, I think. Because all the different temporalities in the beginning, I mean, they were all somehow new to me, because I don't think like this usually. They were thinking tools, to think through certain aspects. And so with data time, I just want to bring up here, related to data time, the statistics of my project, which I found amazing. This almost 30 million data points that I collected in 3 months. I mean, 30 million. And the good thing was I had the tools that I use, they are all open. They give me the data, they give me the raw data. And at one point I thought, I recorded one breathing session. I want to look at the data now. Also, they won't tell me much. And I tried to open, it was a simple text file, and I tried to open it and it never opened. It took for ages, and all of a sudden it opened, and it was, I don't know how many, 2,000 pages or something. Oh, fucking hell, what is this? And that was for me, that was a very interesting moment that made for me graspable. So there is 30 minutes in time, there is my body, where certain parameters are measured. And then I get, 2,000 pages of data that make absolutely no sense to me. That gave me a moment where I got the understanding closer what data is, and what big data is, and why we need big data in order to, find patterns, etc., etc. So that was also for me an interest in data science, was to do a project where my body is related somehow to data, to better understand it, because it's very abstract. Yeah. Not home.
Not home. Yeah, how can we come to a final round before we open it? The final chapter is called Coming Together. How do all the things that we have said and that we have missed out saying, how do they come together at the end, and what's important to say for you?
I mean, maybe I start. So for me it was like a really exciting journey to go with Felix on this exploration of these different temporalities, because for both of us it was completely new thinking. We entered new territory, and it's like, oh my God, where are we now? We know each other for 20 years. We worked on copyright and commons and code and technopolitics and all very human-centered technopolitics. But all of a sudden we were thinking, oh, what is life? And what is evolution? Where does my body, this one body, where does this come from? Long history. Why is my nose like it is? Because a few million years ago it looked different, the human nose. So this was all completely new. And it was very exciting, I think, and it was really, for me, such a step to... I would never have done it alone. We talked about this. It was only possible because we know each other for so long time, and we work together for so long time that we completely trust each other. And I just, write down something. I say, I think this and this. Is this complete nonsense, or does it make any sense? And that's how we developed this book, and we navigated through these temporalities. And it was all rather new. And with this planetary moment, it was interesting because I suggested at one point that we frame our two different projects as exercises in planetary thinking. which we have to learn because we don't know how it works, because we usually, Western minds work differently. So it was a starting point, and but there was a breakthrough in it that had, on the one hand, to do with the breathing exercises. It really opened up some relationality that I was not aware before. But it was also the realization of the planetary moment, or however we call this, that we could kind of grasp a little bit through the dialogue about our two projects.
Yeah. And for me, what really kind of came together, coming from a very, working quite deeply in kind of network cultures and digital spheres, was a different way of understanding kind of the materiality. And in a way, a reframing of technology as a very, very small kind of layer of the planetary, but also a really critical one. And how do you balance this understanding that this is really a critical layer that affects everything else, but it's in itself a very small one. So if you try to concentrate only on that, and we're doing that now with artificial intelligence, it's a very kind of intra-digital kind of way of thinking, and that for me opened up a very different trajectory. It still has technology in a place that I think it needs to be, because this is kind of the world we're living in and the world we have to live in. But understanding what a small aspect it is, and how to articulate these other aspects in relation and through its reformulation through that technology, has been a very it's been interesting. And I finally got out and looked at birds. So I know at least one species of birds now.
Yeah, for me it was very fascinating, this sort of forth and back to have ancient wisdom, but and to have technological optimism or techno-optimism, but it's, how I read it, it's always with and against ancient wisdom, and it's always with and against techno-optimism. And you were talking about ambiguity in the beginning, and this is also what I really liked. So, is anyone still interested into doing a breathing exercise?
Outside.
Outside?
The cigarette.
Sure. With a cigarette.
All right. Okay, then I would say thank you very much.